So now we can ask the big payoff question. After surveying National Socialist theory and practice and engaging with Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, we can ask, to what extent were the Nazis justified in seeing Friedrich Nietzsche as a precursor of their movement? We know that Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, most of the major intellectuals of National Socialism, that they were great admirers of Nietzsche's philosophy, that they read him avidly during their formative years, recommended him to their friends, and incorporated sayings and themes from Nietzsche's writings into their own writings, speeches, and policies. To what extent were they justified in doing so? In my judgment on this complicated question, a split decision is called for. In some very important respects, the Nazis were perfectly justified in seeing Nietzsche as a forerunner and as an intellectual ally. And in some other important respects, Nietzsche would properly have been horrified at the misuse of his philosophy by the Nazis. Let's start with the key differences between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and here I want to single out 5 important points. Take the phrase, the blonde beast. In recoiling from what he saw as a flaccid 19th century European culture, Nietzsche often longingly called for some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race which, organized for war and with the ability to organize, unhesitatingly lays its terrible claws upon a populace. And he spoke of the deep and icy mistrust the German still arouses today whenever he gets into a position of power, is an echo of that inextinguishable horror with which Europe observed for centuries that raging of the blonde Germanic beast. And again, inspirationally about what one finds at the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again and go back to the wilderness. What are we to make of these regular positive mentions of the blonde beast? It's clear what the Nazis made of them, an endorsement by Nietzsche of the superiority of the German Aryan type. But for those who've read the original Nietzsche, it's clear that that interpretation takes Nietzsche's words out of context. In context, the blonde beast that Nietzsche refers to is the lion, the great feline predator of the shaggy blonde mane and the terrific roar. Nietzsche does believe that the Germans once, a long time ago, manifested the spirit of the lion, but they were not unique in that regard. The power and spirit of the lion have been manifested by peoples of many races. Let's put one of the quotations in full context to see this. A moment ago I quoted this line to you. At the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory, this hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again and go back to the wilderness. Now let's complete the sentence as Nietzsche wrote it. The Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need. So Nietzsche is clearly using the lion analogically and is comparing its predatory power with the predatory power that many races have manifested. Here he lists 6 different races and ethnic groupings, and the Germans are not special or unique on that list. So while Nietzsche does advocate a biological basis for culture, he does not endorse a racism in the sense of holding that any one race is necessarily superior to any other. And this is a clear difference with the Nazis. The Nazis were racist and thought of the Germanic racial type as superior to all others the world over. Nietzsche disagreed. In fact, this leads us to a second major difference. While the Nazis put the German Aryan type first, Nietzsche is almost never complimentary about his fellow Germans. In Nietzsche's view, Germany has slipped into flabbiness and whininess. While the Germans once, long ago, were something to be awed and feared, 19th century Germany has become a nation of religious revivalism, socialism, of movements toward equality and democracy. Whatever special endowments the Germans once possessed, contemporary Germany has lost. Nietzsche makes this clear when speaking about the Germany of the 19th century. Between the old Germanic tribes and us Germans, there exists hardly a conceptual relationship, let alone one of blood. So rather than feeling proud of their ancient history and accomplishments, Nietzsche believes the Germans of his day should feel ashamed by comparison. At the same time, German intellectual and cultural life is prominent the world over, and Nietzsche deplores that fact. Germany of the 19th century is a center of softness and decay, so Germany's weaknesses, in his view, are infecting the rest of the world. As he puts it in a work entitled The Will to Power, Aryan influence has corrupted all the world. So rather than celebrating contemporary Germany and its power as the Nazis would do, Nietzsche is disgusted by contemporary Germany. And this leads us to a third major point of difference. The most disgusting sign of Germany's decline, Nietzsche writes, and this may surprise you, is its hatred of the Jews, its virulent and almost irrational anti-Semitism. Now, Nietzsche himself has said some harsh things about the Jews, but again, this is a set of issues that are easily misinterpreted, so we must be careful. In addition to all of the negative things that Nietzsche said about the Jews, we must also note the following. Nietzsche speaks of the anti-Jewish stupidity of the Germans. He speaks of those psychologically disturbed individuals who are most consumed with self-hatred and envy. He uses the French word ressentiment to describe such nauseating individuals, and says that such ressentiment is studied most easily in anarchists and anti-Semites. Pathological dishonesty is a symptom of such repulsive characters. An anti-Semite certainly is not any more decent because he lies as a matter of principle. So Nietzsche saves some of his most condemnatory language for Germans who hate Jews. He considers them to be liars, stupid, disturbed, self-hating pathological cases for psychologists with strong stomachs to study. So it seems a reasonable inference that Nietzsche would have been disgusted by the Nazis, for the Nazis incorporated into their ideology the worst possible kind of anti-Semitism and pursued their anti-Jew policies almost to the point of self-destruction. But how does this fit with all of the harsh things that we know Nietzsche said about the Jews? This brings us to a fourth major difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis. For all of the negative things that Nietzsche says about the Jews, he also respects them and gives them high praise. Here's a representative quotation from Beyond Good and Evil. The Jews, however, are beyond any doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race now living in Europe. Here is another from a work called The Antichrist. Psychologically considered, the Jewish people are a people endowed with the toughest vital energy, who, placed in impossible circumstances, divined a power in these instincts with which one could prevail against the world. He again praises the Jews for having the strength to rule Europe if they chose to. That the Jews, if they wanted it, or if they were forced into it, which seems to be what the anti-Semites want, could even now have preponderance, indeed quite literally mastery over Europe, that is certain. That they are not working and planning for it, that is equally certain. And in another work, Nietzsche compares the Jews favorably to the Germans. In fact, he identifies a way in which the Jews are superior to the Germans. Europe owes the Jews no small thanks for making its people more logical, for cleaner intellectual habits, none more so than the Germans, a lamentably déraisonnable race that even today first needs to be given a good mental drubbing. But how can all of this praise of the Jews fit with the rest of what Nietzsche has said about them? One important distinction here is between blaming the Jews of several millennia ago for developing the slave morality and foisting it upon the world, and between evaluating the Jews of today as inheritors of a cultural tradition that has enabled them to survive and even flourish, often despite great adversity. In the former case, Nietzsche assigns blame to the Jews and condemns them for subverting the potential for human greatness. But in the latter case, he would have to grant, at the very least, however grudgingly, that the Jews have hit upon a survival strategy that has enabled them to keep their cultural traditions intact for well over 2,000 years. How many other cultures can make that claim? The list is very short, and for that, the Jews deserve praise. One more key difference between Nietzsche and the Nazis is important, and that is their views on Christianity. Nietzsche consistently states that Judaism and Christianity are allies, both stemming from the same source, both advocating a religious morality that puts the weak, the sick, and the humble first. As with Judaism, Christian morality is slave morality. Christianity, he writes, is a rebellion of everything that crawls on the ground against that which has height. The Christians, he writes, did not know how to love their God except by crucifying man. And for that great crime against humanity, Nietzsche says, I condemn Christianity. I raise against the Christian church the most terrible of all accusations that any accuser ever uttered. It is to me the highest of all conceivable corruptions. So Christianity did not escape Nietzsche's wrath, just as Judaism did not escape Nietzsche's wrath, and for the same reasons. Christianity is an extension and a purification of moral themes first developed within Judaism. In Nietzsche's own words, in Christianity, all of Judaism attains its ultimate mastery as the art of lying in a holy manner. The Christian, the ultima ratio of the lie, is the Jew once more, even 3 times more. This identification of Christianity with Judaism also separates Nietzsche from the Nazis, for the Nazis took great pains to separate Jews and Christians, condemning Judaism and embracing a generic type of Christianity. Early in the Nazi Party's history, in its 1920 founding political document, the party program, point number 24 states the following. The party as such stands for positive Christianity, without, however, allying itself to any particular denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit. The use of Christian themes and imagery was prominent in Nazi propaganda throughout the 1920s. Recall this political poster with the Christian spiritual figure embracing the German soldier. In Joseph Goebbels' semi-autobiographical novel, Michael, the main character is portrayed as a hybrid Christ figure and German martyr. And in a 1935 interview, Goebbels was so concerned to separate Christianity from Judaism that he went as far as to deny that Jesus was a Jew. Adolf Hitler himself often used Christian moral imagery and themes in public pronouncements such as the following. When I came to Berlin a few weeks ago, the luxury, the perversion, the iniquity, the wanton display, and the Jewish materialism disgusted me so thoroughly that I was almost beside myself. I nearly imagined myself to be Jesus Christ when he came to his Father's temple and found it taken by the money changers. I can well imagine how he felt when he seized a whip and scourged them out. So to summarize, we have 5 significant partings of the ways between Nietzsche and the Nazis. First, the Nazis believed the German Aryan to be racially superior, while Nietzsche believes that the superior types can be manifested in any racial type. Second, the Nazis believed contemporary German culture to be the highest and best hope for the world, while Nietzsche holds contemporary German culture to be degenerate and to be infecting the rest of the world. Third, the Nazis are enthusiastically anti-Semitic, while Nietzsche sees anti-Semitism to be a moral sickness. Fourth, the Nazis hate all things Jewish, while Nietzsche praises the Jews for their toughness, their intelligence, and their sheer survival ability. Fifth, and finally, the Nazis see Christianity to be radically different from and much superior to Judaism, while Nietzsche believes Judaism and Christianity to be essentially the same, with Christianity being in fact a worse and more dangerous variation of Judaism. Those strike me as important differences and to lend support to those interpreters of Nietzsche who complain about simple identifications of Nietzsche as a proto-Nazi philosopher. But there are equally important ways in which the Nazis were right on target in seeing Nietzsche as an intellectual ally. We know that the National Socialists were anti-individualistic and collectivistic. For them, the relevant groups were the Aryan Germans and everyone else. Individuals were defined by the groups to which they belonged, and individuals were seen only as vehicles through which groups achieved their interests. The Nazis rejected the Western liberal idea that individuals were ends in themselves. To the Nazis, individuals were servants of the groups to which they belonged. The anti-individualism of the Nazis was most blatant in their treatment of Jews. They did not see Jews as individuals with moral rights and significance. They saw only members of a group that they wished to destroy. This meant as a matter of policy that the Nazis were uncaring about the lives of individuals, and that they were willing to destroy as many individuals' lives as was necessary to achieve their group's advantage. Even within their own group, the Nazis did not see the German Aryans fundamentally as individuals. They saw them as members of the Volk, the German people, the group to which they owed service, obedience, and even their lives. Nietzsche has a reputation for being an individualist. There are individualist elements in Nietzsche's philosophy, but in my judgment, his reputation for individualism is often much overstated. When we speak of philosophies as being individualist or collectivist, three key points are at issue. First, we ask, do individuals shape their own identities, or are their identities created by forces beyond their control? Do individuals have the capacity to decide their own beliefs, to form their own characters? Or is their identity fundamentally a matter of their biological inheritance, or shaped by the cultural groups in which they are born and raised? Second, we ask, are individuals ends in themselves with their own lives and purposes to pursue? Or do individuals exist for the sake of something beyond themselves, to which they are expected to subordinate their interests? Third, we ask, do the decisive events in human life and history happen because individuals, often exceptional individuals, make them happen? Or do the decisive events in history result from collective action or from there being larger forces at work? Let's take the first issue, whether individuals shape themselves significantly or whether they're a product of forces beyond their control. Only in an attenuated way does Nietzsche think that individuals shape their characters or destinies. To a great extent, he is a determinist, believing that individuals are a product of their biological heritage. As he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil, one cannot erase from the soul of a human being what his ancestors liked most to do and did most constantly. Any given individual's thoughts, feelings, and actions are the expression of an underlying set of traits that the individual inherited. Whether one is a sheep or a wolf is a matter of biology. One does not choose or shape oneself significantly. So to that extent, it does not make sense to hold individuals responsible for who they are or what they become. What about the second issue? Does Nietzsche believe that individuals are ends in themselves, that they exist for their own sake? Emphatically not. Here's where I think many casual readings of Nietzsche get him dead wrong. Take an obvious point. Nietzsche has nothing but contempt for the vast majority of the human population, believing them to be sheep who are a disgrace to the dignity of the human species. Their individual lives have no value in themselves. This is Nietzsche's point in the following quotation, where he explicitly denies that his philosophy is individualistic. My philosophy aims at an ordering of rank, not at an individualistic morality. Nietzsche believes that most individuals have no right to exist, and more brutally, that if they were sacrificed or even slaughtered, that would be an improvement. In Nietzsche's own words, mankind in the mass sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man, that would be an advance. And again, one must learn from war. One must learn to sacrifice many and to take one's cause seriously enough not to spare men. It is hard to see as an individualist anyone who sees no value at all in the lives of the vast majority of individuals. And it is hard to see as an individualist anyone who would sacrifice those individuals in the name of improving the species. Improving the species is a collectivistic goal, and measuring the value of individuals in terms of their value to the species and sacrificing those that don't measure up, that is textbook collectivism. This connects directly to the value that Nietzsche sees in the few great individuals who crop up in each generation. It is his powerfully poetic rhetoric about those exceptional individuals that gives Nietzsche his reputation for being an individualist. But it is important to note here that Nietzsche does not see even those exceptional individuals as ends in themselves, and he does not exempt them from the sacrifice. The point of becoming an exceptional individual is not to advance one's own life and interests. It is to improve the human species. In fact, to get beyond the human species to a higher species type, the overman. As Nietzsche says repeatedly, not mankind, but overman is the goal. Nietzsche's goal is a collectivist one, to bring about a new, future, higher species type, the overman. This is the significance of his exhortations about the Übermensch, the superman or overman. So none of us, whether weak or strong, exists for our own sake. In contrast to individualists who believe that individuals' lives are their own to find and create meaning within, Nietzsche believes that individuals have value only to the extent that they fulfill a collectivist end beyond their lives, the creation of a stronger species. And on that general collectivist end, Nietzsche shares an important point in common with the Nazis. There's also the third sub-issue of individualism, whether the decisive events in human life and history happen because individuals, generally exceptional individuals, make them happen, or whether individuals are pawns of larger forces. Here the Nazis were a combination of both parts. They believed in and utilized mass movement politics. They saw their political movement as a vehicle through which a powerful cultural force, the German Volk, was asserting its historical destiny. At the same time, the Nazis believed that those powerful historical forces singled out special individuals to perform special tasks, and that destiny spoke through those special individuals. This, at any rate, was Hitler's firm belief when he made statements such as the following: "I carry out the commands that Providence has laid upon me," and "No power on earth can shake the German Reich now. Divine Providence has willed it that I carry through the fulfillment of the Germanic task." In invoking divine providence, Hitler is drawing upon a long philosophical tradition that goes back most famously to Georg Hegel, an early 19th century German philosopher, with his world historical individuals. Those individuals such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, who, on Hegel's view, were vehicles through which the spiritual forces of history operated. And that tradition goes back even further in most religious interpretations of history. Think, for example, of religious prophets. Prophets are special individuals within a religious tradition. Yet, a prophet is not special as an individual. He's not an individual who has acquired his powers through his own efforts, and he is not someone who has created his own new and unique vision. Rather, the prophet is special only because God has chosen him and is speaking through him. The prophet is totally a tool. It is God who works through him, and he is a mouthpiece for God's message. The prophet is a localized vehicle through which the real force, God, works. Now let's return to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is an atheist, but he offers a secular and somewhat watered-down version of the same theory. Nietzsche's powerful force is not spiritual or religious, but biological. His special individuals, great prophets such as Zarathustra, are individuals in whom powerful evolutionary forces have converged to create something remarkable. And those powerful forces are operating through the Zarathustras to create something even more remarkable, the Overman. The Zarathustras do not develop and use power. Rather, power develops them and uses them. They are only the tools, the vehicles through which power operates. This is what Nietzsche means in quotations such as the following: "Every living creature values many things higher than life itself. Yet out of this evaluation itself speaks the will to power." The will to power works through those individuals. It's not that those individuals develop and use power. There's legitimate controversy among scholars over this interpretation of Nietzsche, but to the extent that it is true, it does undermine Nietzsche's reputation as an individualist, and it does lend support to the claim that the Nazis have on Nietzsche as a philosophical forerunner. A second major point of agreement between Nietzsche and the Nazis is their view of conflict. For both, conflict is the fundamental human reality, and both believe firmly that life is a matter of some individuals and groups advancing their interests at the expense of others. The Nazis were clear about this in theory and practice. They did not believe it possible for Aryans and Jews to live together in harmony. Nor did the Nazis think it possible for Germany to live harmoniously with the liberal capitalist nations of the West. In those liberal capitalist nations, by contrast, many economists and politicians had come to believe that the productive power of the Industrial Revolution led to surpluses, and surpluses led to trade between nations that was mutually beneficial. Trade, they thought, was a powerful harmonizing force. The Nazis, by contrast, rejected that view entirely and believed that recent economic history was a matter of the Jews and the capitalists advancing their interests at the expense of Germany. Nietzsche shares with the Nazis the general point about zero-sum conflict. In his words, "The well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value." But even more strongly, he does not believe that this conflict is merely a matter of historical and cultural accident, but is built into the requirements of life. Here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. The horse eats the grass, the lion kills the horse, the man rides the horse and kills the lion. Life is an ongoing struggle between strong and weak, predator and prey. Cooperation and trade are possible, but they are superficial interludes between more fundamental animal facts about life. As Nietzsche again puts it, life always lives at the expense of other life. He who does not grasp this has not taken even the first step toward honesty with himself. On this point, Nietzsche and the Nazis agree. Now, given that the conflict is fundamental and inescapable, the next question to ask is, how will the conflicts be resolved? Hitler was fond of saying, in private, "What luck that men do not think." Another significant point of agreement exists between Nietzsche and the Nazis. Both agree that the great conflicts will not be solved rationally through a process of discussion, argument, persuasion, and diplomacy. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis were strong irrationalists in their view of human psychology, and this has important social and political implications. Think about democracy for a moment. In particular, think about how much confidence in the power of reason that democracies require. Democracy is a matter of decentralizing political power, giving each individual a vote. The assumption of democracies is that individuals have the ability to weigh and judge important matters and to cast responsible votes. The expectation of democracies is that individuals will have ongoing discussions about a great many matters, that they will be able to assess the evidence, the arguments, and the counter-arguments. It's also expected that they will be able to learn from their mistakes and, when appropriate, to change their votes the next time around. It's not an accident that neither Nietzsche nor the Nazis was an advocate of either democracy or of reason. Hitler in particular believed that a highly developed intellect was a weakness and that too much reliance on reason was a sickness. He believed that Germany's recent problems stemmed from too much thinking. The intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life. What Germany required was passion, a storm of emotion arising from deeply rooted instincts and drives. Only a storm of glowing passion can turn the destinies of nations, but this passion can only be roused by a man who carries it within himself. So German training and propaganda were not directed to presenting facts and arguments, but rather to inflaming the passions of the masses. Reason, logic, and objectivity were beside the point. "We are not objective, we are German," said Hans Schemm, the first Nazi Minister of Culture. Here again, there's a connection to Nietzsche. Nietzsche too sees an opposition between conscious reason and unconscious instinct, and he disparages those who stress rationality, or those who engage in what he calls the ridiculous overestimation and misunderstanding of consciousness. In his own words, it is rationality against instinct. And rationality is the least useful guiding power that humans possess. Humans came out of a long evolutionary line that relied on drives and instincts, and those drives and instincts served us well for millennia. However, humans eventually became settled, tamed, and civilized, and in Nietzsche's view, they lost something crucial. In this new world, they no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. Note that Nietzsche says our unconscious drives are infallible, if only we can find them within ourselves again. It is our strongest, most assertive unconscious drives we should let rule our lives. Instinct is, of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far, the most intelligent. And on this point, Nietzsche and the Nazis are in agreement. Both are fundamentally irrationalists. They do not think much of the power of reason, and they urge themselves and others to let their strongest passions and instincts well up within them and be released upon the world. Now put the three above points together: collectivism, conflict, and irrationalism. What will the social result be? If you believe wholeheartedly and passionately that your identity is found by merging yourself into your group, that your group is locked in a mortal zero-sum conflict with other groups, that reason is a superficial force and that instinct and passion drive the world, how will you conduct yourself and assert yourself in that conflict? For much of the 19th century, Western liberal capitalists had started to wonder whether war was a thing of the past. In their judgment, progress had been made. During the Enlightenment of the 18th century, much of the West embraced the idea that individuals have rights, rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. In the 19th century, those rights had been extended in practice to women, and slavery had been eliminated. Also in the 19th century came the full realization of the power of the Industrial Revolution and the idea that through technology and capitalism, economic production could be increased dramatically. As a result, the liberal capitalists of the 19th century came to believe that poverty was a problem that could be solved and that we could eliminate most of our conflicts over wealth. They believed that with rising wealth and education, rational people could learn to respect each other's rights. They could learn that there was more to be gained from trade than from war, that peace was a natural state that mankind could achieve. The horrors of war could become a thing of the past. We know from tragic 20th century history the National Socialists' eagerness to use war as their primary tool of achieving their international goals. We know of their praising as fundamental the martial spirit and the beauty of the warrior. We know of their total recasting of the education of children to achieve, as Hitler wanted, a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. Youth must be all that. It must bear pain. There must be nothing weak and gentle about it. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. The beast of prey phrase is again rhetoric inspired directly by Nietzsche. On the importance and nobility of war, Nietzsche and the Nazis were in full agreement. Nietzsche praised war and urged its coming. He wished for a great purge that would wipe out most humans, whose lives he thought worthless and an embarrassment to the human species. All too many live, and all too long they hang on their branches. Would that a storm came to shake all this worm-eaten rot from the tree. But he also longed for war as a means to inspire those humans who have the potential to advance us toward the overman. And to that end, Nietzsche believes war is absolutely essential. War essential. It is vain rhapsodizing and sentimentality to continue to expect much, even more to expect a very great deal from mankind, once it has learned not to wage war. For the time being, we know of no other means to imbue exhausted peoples, as strongly and surely as every great war does, with that raw energy of the battleground, that deep, impersonal hatred, that murderous cold-bloodedness with a good conscience, that communal, organized ardor in destroying the enemy, that proud indifference to great losses, to one's own existence and to that of one's friends, that muted, earthquake-like convulsion of the soul. And against those who believe that we have entered a more peaceful era and that perhaps war is no longer necessary, Nietzsche reminds us again in an especially chilling quotation, "The beginnings of everything great on earth are soaked in blood thoroughly and for a long time." On this score, the Nazis were thoroughly Nietzschean. Rather than pushing for a recognition of the mutuality of human interests, as Western liberal capitalists have been doing for much of the 19th century, and rather than seeking reasonable and peaceful diplomatic solutions to the ordinary collisions of international politics, the Nazis committed fundamentally to war as their means of self-regeneration and dominance in world politics. A fifth and final set of themes link Nietzsche with the Nazis. Both were anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal. The Nazis were no friends of democracy, but they were effective players of democracy. Right from the beginning, in their founding document, the 1920 Party Program, they announced their authoritarian political principles. Nonetheless, finding themselves operating in a democracy, the democracy that was the Weimar Republic of the 1920s, they played mostly by the rules and simply out-democracied the other parties. They used democracy to achieve anti-democratic ends. Nietzsche's political views are less developed and more ambiguous, but it is clear that he favors some sort of aristocracy. "What is serious for me," Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "is the European problem as I understand it, the cultivation of a new caste that will rule Europe." Again, while Nietzsche is unspecific, he most likely does not mean a formal political aristocracy. He most likely means the de facto rule by an exceptional few, whatever the formal and official political structures happen to be. In this way, while Nietzsche despises the impulses that give rise to democracy, he's not particularly worried by the dominance of actual democratic forms of government. He sees them simply as instruments that the exceptional few will use, most likely from behind the scenes, to achieve their ends. As he puts it, "Democracy will be a tool of a master race, the future masters of the earth, philosophical men of power and artist tyrants who will employ democratic Europe as their most pliant and supple instrument for getting hold of the destinies of the earth." Nietzsche is not programmatic about what specific form the new aristocratic class will take or what specific goals it will pursue. He believes that will be up to the overmen themselves. They will create their own values and shape the institutional vehicles by which they'll achieve them. Nietzsche did not think of himself as an overman, merely the herald of their arrival. But Nietzsche is exceptionally clear that any social method, however brutal, will be legitimate if the new aristocratic class desires it. A healthy aristocracy, as Nietzsche puts it, accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of untold human beings who, for its sake, must be reduced and lowered to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments. That is certainly anti-liberal, and it fits well with Nietzsche's self-assessment that he is not by any means liberal. In addition to dismissing liberalism, Nietzsche also dismisses capitalism as a dehumanizing system, and he also rejects individualism when it comes to matters of sexuality and marriage. Marriage, he thought, should not be based on an idiosyncrasy, that is to say, on personal love and sexual attraction. Rather, he suggests marriage should be state-run for breeding purposes. On all of those points, the Nazis can and did find inspiration in Nietzsche's philosophy. So, again, to summarize, we have 5 significant connections between Nietzsche and the Nazis. First, the Nazis were strongly collectivistic, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, also advances strongly collectivistic and anti-individualistic positions. Second, both Nietzsche and the Nazis see zero-sum conflict as inescapable, as fundamental to the human condition. Third, both are irrationalists in their psychological theories, downplaying radically the role that reason plays in life and emphasizing the power and the glory of instincts and feelings. Fourth, both Nietzsche and the Nazis accept willingly, even longingly, that war is a necessary, healthy, and even majestic enterprise. Fifth and finally, both Nietzsche and the Nazis are anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal, and so come the 1930s in fundamental opposition to those nations in the West that were still broadly committed to democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. We know from historical hindsight that it took a world war to defeat the Nazis. Tens of millions of people died in that war, actual human beings who lived, loved, cried, had dreams, and then died long before they should have. Millions of others had their lives damaged or seriously disrupted. And over above that, the economic and cultural costs of the war, the wrecking of people's homes, the obliteration of works of art, the destruction of historical landmarks, all of those costs are probably incalculable. The Nazis lost that war, but it was a close call, and there's no guarantee that it won't happen again. And this is why it's absolutely important that we really understand National Socialism. By the 1930s, the Nazis had the entire intellectual, cultural, and political muscle of Germany at their disposal. Over and above that, they had an idealistic philosophy that motivated and energized millions. More than anything else, that intellectual and idealistic power made the Nazis an awesome force to be reckoned with. History has taught us that the philosophy and ideals the Nazis stood for are false and terribly destructive. But we do not do ourselves any favor by writing the Nazis off as madmen or as an historical oddity that will never happen again. The Nazis stood for philosophical and political principles that appealed to millions, that attracted some of the best minds of their generation, and that still command the hearts and minds of millions of people in all parts of the world. And that means that we must understand the National Socialist philosophical and political ideals for what they actually are. We must understand them. We must know where they came from. We must understand their intellectual and emotional power. Then and only then will we be able to defeat them. And we will be able to defeat them because we will understand their power and we will be able to develop more powerful arguments with which to fight back. Arguing over philosophical and political ideals is often unpleasant. And the issues involved are often complex, abstract, and emotionally difficult. But there are no shortcuts, and perhaps the best motivation for doing the hard work is to remind ourselves regularly and often how much more it costs to settle disputes by war. We may not like that the Nazis had arguments and positions that many people find attractive. We may find it repulsive to take their arguments seriously. We might find it difficult to get inside their heads to see where they're coming from. But we have a choice. We can either fight them in theory, or we can fight them in practice. We can either fight them in the intellectual realm, or we can fight them on the battlefield. It might still come to fighting them on the battlefield, but that is always the most terrible option, the option that is the most expensive in every way possible, and the one we should avoid if there is any other way to defeat them. So that means that defeating National Socialism intellectually is the strategy that we should follow first. Defeating them intellectually means taking their positions seriously, understanding them, and knowing how to argue against them. The second rule of politics is know your enemy. Of course, the first rule of politics is know yourself. Know who you are, what you stand for, and why. Know what matters to you fundamentally, and what you are willing to do to achieve it, and when necessary, to defend it. That is, of course, a very large project, which is why a culture's philosophers and intellectuals do valuable work, or, if they get it wrong, great damage. But as an indication of where to start on this large project, let me sketch out the following. Philosophically and politically, the Nazis stood for 5 major principles. They stood for collectivism, for instinct and passion, for war and conflict, for authoritarianism, and for socialism. That means that we can identify the principles that, in each case, are the opposite of what the Nazis stood for. The Nazis stood for collectivism. The opposite of that is a philosophy of individualism that recognizes each individual's right to live for his or her own sake. The Nazis stood for instinct and passion as one's basic guides in life. The opposite of that is a philosophy of reason that has a healthy confidence in the power of logic and evidence to guide one's life. The Nazis stood for war and conflict as the best way to achieve one's goals. The opposite of that is a philosophy that encourages productiveness and peaceful trade as the best way to achieve one's goals in life. The Nazis stood for political authoritarianism and top-down leadership. The opposite of that is a philosophy that leaves individuals maximum liberty and freedom to live their lives by their own choices and direction, as long as they respect the equal right of other individuals to do the same. The Nazis stood for socialism and the principle of central direction of the economy for the common good. The opposite of that is the system of capitalism, with individual producers and consumers deciding for themselves what they will produce and what they will spend their money on. As a start, the principles in the right-hand column are the best antidote to Nazism we have going. Each of those principles is controversial in our own time, and I expect they will continue to be so for generations to come. But they represent the starkest possible philosophical contrast to National Socialism, and they form the first line of intellectual defense against future incarnations of Nazism. There's no better place to start than with understanding them thoroughly. I will end by stressing this point in a provocative way. The Nazis knew what they stood for. Do we?